and our ambassador. Recording, awesome. So I want to start off, before we begin our conversation, I want to introduce our three wonderful panelists, Ans, Kartik, and Roseann. So I will just give their brief bios and then we'll go right into our conversation today. So first off, we have Kartik Amarnath. Kartik is an aspiring clinician based in Brooklyn, New York, with professional and academic backgrounds in environmental justice and critical urban studies. He is the policy specialist at Push Buffalo, as well as an MD and MPH candidate currently on leave at SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University. The third culture kid of an Indo-Malaysian mother and a Sri Lankan Tamil father, he grew up in 4 countries. He spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in Kuala Lumpur, studying environmental gentrification in his mother's childhood neighborhood of Brickfields, and was the former energy planner at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, where he worked on energy policies and programs serving frontline communities. He has previously worked with the CDC, Democracy Now!, the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and the Tishman Environment and Design Center. In 2021, he was named an Archival Creators Fellow with the South Asian American Digital Archive. His writing on public health, climate change, politics, and environmental justice has been published in Tides Magazine, Environmental Health News, The Guardian, Naked Capitalism, the Albany Times Union, and academic journals in law and medicine. Thank you for joining us. Next off, we have Roseann Bongiovanni. Roseann has worked for environmental justice for more than 25 years. Her extensive career began as a young organizer with the Chelsea Green Space Committee and included victories defeating the construction of a diesel power plant and preventing ethanol bomb trains from traveling to a Chelsea Creek oil terminal. In 2016, Roseann transitioned this vital work into the independent environmental justice and public health organization Green Roots, which played a critical role in the response to COVID-19 in Chelsea and East Boston. Under her leadership, Chelsea was named a Culture of Health Prize winner in 2017. Green Roots was selected as a social innovator in 2018 and was named a US EPA Merit Award winner in 2021. Roseann has raised and managed millions of dollars for major projects, including Creekside Commons Park, federally funded air emissions reduction work, 5 urban growing spaces, murals and other public art projects, massive tree plantings, and multiple community parks. Roseann is a lifelong Chelsea resident, a former city councilor, and city council president. She holds a master's of public health from Boston University and is the mother of 2 strong-minded children. Finally, we have Ans Irfan. Ans is a global public health pracademic with over a decade and a half of multidisciplinary experience in advancing global health equity across several continents, cultures, and public health systems. He has been serving as a faculty member, researcher, and practitioner at George Washington University for the past half a decade. He also serves in senior leadership and advisory roles with various organizations, including the advisory board of the APHA Center for Climate, Health, and Equity, the APHA Governing Council, the DC Public Health Association, and as a transdisciplinary conversion science subject matter expert on health equity, environmental racism, social justice, and climate justice policies and programs with the EPA, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, among others. Select recent projects include farm workers' health equity, the intersection of religion and public health, traffic wardens and climate adaptation in Pakistan, evaluation of physicians' training on climate change and health, and social equity implications of climate innovation at the intersection of technology and climate entrepreneurship. So we have 3 kick off the question for all of you. We'll have Ans go first, but environmental justice is a really hot topic right now. And you all ambassadors will be working for environmental justice. So my question for you panelists is, how would you define environmental justice in your own words? And what in your personal or professional life has informed your understanding or made it important?
Becca, forgive me, you were cutting off. You would like me to go first, correct? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. If I may invite everyone to turn on their camera if you're comfortable and if that's all right. But if not, that's totally fine as well, but did want to extend that. So environmental justice, instead of sort of like giving a pithy little neat definition that's academic, I think I'm just going to talk in a discursive way about it, but try to keep it as brief as I can. So I think like it's really as we've read it a million times, the notion of fairness and justice. But I think we need to scrutinize that fairness and justice, that who is defining that fairness and justice, right? So thinking about that part, the like, from when we talk about engaging communities, what does that mean in practice, right? So to me, the notion of environmental justice really is that fairness and justice, but from our interpersonal perspective, from our organizational perspective, from our societal perspective, if that does not involve some degree of discomfort that's going to come with structural changes, we're just doing performative work. So like, I think like, so that is a long-winded abstract way of saying that we need to be internalizing that part in a meaningful way and thinking about that what specific outcomes and structural changes that particular project or set of projects are resulting in. So that to me is sort of like, the notion of environmental justice really is that that a lot of times I see that, fantastic organizations doing amazing work are just sprinkling the term all over as a sort of like, as an afterthought, as opposed to engaging in it in a meaningful way, which is going to come from taking some calculated risks, including political ones with administrations like the Biden administration, which has a pretty horrendous record, right? Like, you can see that like, everyone loves praising them because we've lowered the bar so much with the previous administration. So to me, the idea there really is that why is that a standard, right? So like, so thinking about that part and then sort of like, not foreclosing the category, that sort of like, not using moral relativism as a defense shield. I'll just quickly comment in terms of like my personal and professional experiences. I grew up in a former British colony in Pakistan. And now I'm in a settled colonial nation, and in so many different ways that a lot of those systems continue to pay dividends. And in my case, I grew up in a small village in a farming family. So you had sort of like, issues related to water rationing. You had issues related to the canal system that really destroyed a lot of the farming land around where those canals were built. So that trickled into economic anxiety and family dysfunction, right? So that's sort of like, that's how personal and close this thing is to me in so many different ways. But yeah, like I'll just leave it at that for now. Yeah.
And Roseann, do you want to share next?
Yeah, sure. So I always look at environmental injustice rather than saying what environmental justice is. Environmental injustice is the disproportionate burdens that low-income communities and communities of color are shouldering for the benefits of wealthier white communities. And in my personal experience, I grew up in Chelsea, which is just north of Boston, and we have a waterfront along our community. It's called the Chelsea Creek. And growing up in the city of Chelsea, I never realized that I lived in a waterfront community. And I didn't realize that until I was a community organizer at the age of 18 and sort of said, when somebody came to us, an environmental group came to us and said, what are you doing about the Chelsea Creek? And we were like, the what? Like, what do you mean the Chelsea Creek? Like, what's the Chelsea Creek? And it was that sort of inflection point that we sort of sat back and said, hold on, how is it that we're surrounded by water on three sides in Chelsea, and yet we have absolutely no access to our waterfront? We don't consider ourselves a waterfront community. There are no piers, fishing docks, no boating. There's no walkways along the waterfront. And it was really then that we realized that our entire waterfront is really being sacrificed, if you will, for the benefits of the larger region. So the Chelsea Creek waterfront is home to 100% of the jet fuel that's used at Logan International Airport, 80% of New England's heating fuel, gasoline for hundreds of gas stations up and down the mid-Atlantic coast, road salt for over 350 communities in New England. There's so much airport-related businesses along our waterfront, dilapidated piers, just old, dirty industries all along the water's edge. And then the two communities that we're organizing in Chelsea and East Boston are home to Logan International Airport, the Tobin Bridge, and the second largest privately owned produce distribution center. And so with all of that abundance of industries, you could imagine that our community really has almost no open space, no access to the waterfront. In Chelsea, we're the smallest city in the entire state at 1.8 square miles. Within our 1.8 square miles, only 4% of our entire city is open green space, and we have a 2% tree canopy cover despite our valiant efforts to plant thousands and thousands of trees. We're a low-income community and a community of color that has just been facing structural and systemic racism and classism for years and years. And so we're trying to change or reverse that trajectory, and reverse and undo those years of environmental racism and discrimination. And so when I define environmental justice, I think of it as empowered people fighting back against structural racism and oppression to achieve an environment that is benefiting them rather than hurting them. And that's what we're working to do here in Chelsea and East Boston.
Thank you. And Kartik?
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I guess I got the short end of the stick and I'm going last. And so a lot of what's already been said is already deeply rich, and I have to think through what to add to it. I guess I can start off with, what Ans was saying about the academic definition of environmental justice and how we need to think critically about it. Really resonated with me. And so I guess thinking in real time, environmental justice to me is, of course, the equitable distribution of burdens and benefits related to the environment, as well as the meaningful participation and equitable participation of communities in decision-making processes around those distributions of environmental benefits and harms. However, yeah, to go a bit deeper, it's also about operationalizing spaces for community self-determination, like it's approaching environmental justice from a recognition that we do live in a settler colony whose economic engine, the foundation of which was laid by forced labor, slavery, as well as global forms of extraction related to war and imperialism. And therefore, environmental justice is not just about equitable representation of seeing who has a seat at the table and making sure all those numbers add up, but also about, prioritizing voices and leadership of people who have been disproportionately harmed by the systems of oppression that condition the societies that we live in, and so it's a fundamentally political question, and it pushes us to critique things that we've just assumed to be normal, but like profoundly shape human environment relations. So boogeyman words like capitalism, right? Like we need to question whether or not a capitalist system that was built on slavery and settler colonialism and genocide and imperialism is a viable system by which we can sustain the shitstorm that is upon us, which is the climate crisis, right? And so, yeah, I really think we need some redefining and some self-critique in the environmental policy and environmental justice worlds, and listen more closely to frontline communities in terms of what they mean in relation to environmental justice. In terms of what got me interested in environmental justice, my parents come from former colonies themselves. So my mother is Malaysian. Her community was sent to Malaysia as part of the indentured systems of migration that the British Empire utilized once they outlawed slavery. And my mom's community were the rubber tappers, right? So they, through their version of forced labor that they experienced under colonialism, fueled the automotive boom globally, created the conditions for cities like Detroit to get established, and their labor has been completely erased from historical record or our awareness. Meanwhile, the descendants of that community, so folks like my mom and her generation, my generation, although I was not born there, they were forcibly displaced from those plantations once they were converted into palm oil plantations. And if you know anything about palm oil, it's an extremely environmentally destructive product. And so I have a lot of family members who have like died prematurely because of awful relationships that we have with the environment and unjust relationships that we have with the environment that put my people disproportionately in harm's way. And that's what got me interested in environmental justice. I'll stop rambling now. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And it's really interesting to hear about you all come from different backgrounds and have diverse experiences working for environmental justice and against environmental injustices. I really want to dive a little bit deeper into the burden that different communities face and these systems of oppression that you all have mentioned. So colonialism, racism, imperialism, and how they impact environmental justice and the health impacts of environmental justice. I'm wondering, I'm going to start with you, Roseann, in your work with the local Chelsea community. How do you think that we can learn to work with local and frontline communities, but not only work with them, but really have them become agents of change and help them, like, work with them to dismantle these systems of oppression? I know that's a very big question, but how can we do that in our work or begin to think about that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really great one. I feel like there's a lot of value in lived experience, and folks in frontline communities have lived experience, and we need to appreciate, as a society, we need to appreciate and lift that up. I think there's so much emphasis on this degree and that degree and these credentials and that credentials. At the end of the day, the people in these frontline communities, they know what the solutions are. They know what the problems are. They know why these problems are happening. And we need to let them lead. We need to step back as society and let folks in frontline communities lead on the solutions. We need to invest in frontline EJ communities, because I really do believe at the end of the day that folks have the ideas, the solutions, but we're not getting the resources because the resources are being directed to wealthier, more homogeneous communities. As practitioners, I would say always let community lead. Don't be extractive. We saw during COVID, Chelsea was one of the communities that was hardest hit by COVID in Massachusetts. Throughout much of 2020, we had 6 times the state's rate, and we were in the newspaper every single day. We were in the news, in the newspapers, across the country. My mother-in-law, even in Argentina, was like, "Oh my God, I see you all on the newspaper. What's going on in Chelsea? Are you okay?" Like, an entirely different hemisphere was seeing the pain of folks in Chelsea, and name any environmental justice community, and you were basically seeing that, right? And so I feel like there's this process of we sort of locally call it here of like it's like publicity porn, right? It sells newspapers, people look at it, but when you're living in that community and you're on the front page of that newspaper, that doesn't feel really good. It feels extractive, right? And then you see all of these researchers descending on Chelsea. Let's follow your wastewater. Let's swab your nose. Let's get your blood samples. Let's do this. Let's talk about what it's like. No, we don't want to talk about what it's like. No, it friggin' sucks. We don't want to talk about what it's like. So I would say, as practitioners, really try not to be extractive. Let community members lead. If there's research that you're interested in, make sure the community is interested in it as well, and that the community members are leading that research And that if you are gathering data from community, that you're sharing that data back with community members. And that, above all, that you're appreciating the lived experience of those folks and you're compensating them equitably. I always think that, when research is done, there's the PI and the co-PI and all the other folks. How many times are community members listed as, authors on papers? Make sure that folks in the community are being listed, that young people are given these opportunities that, engage young folks and give them this, shepherd them together with this experience so that they can put this on their college applications, and it helps improve their likelihood of, getting scholarships and just being recognized for all of what they have to add and to offer. And so I'll sort of stop. Those are some of my top thoughts.
That was great, and I really appreciate you sharing very, very important techniques to have different community members really become part of this work and this movement. I'm wondering, Kartik, I know that you have different experience in environmental justice in New York City when you were part of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and you worked in energy justice. And I think that's another topic that is really important and part of environmental justice. I'm wondering if you could speak more on how you centered voices of residents in environmental justice communities in New York City, particularly on the topic of energy and how that also relates to inequity and different health issues.
Sure. So I guess just real quick, the environmental injustices of the energy system, which should be relatively obvious, but 70% of people of color live within a 30-mile radius of a coal-fired power plant or an oil refinery. A 30-mile radius is usually the distance where we see the most significant negative health impacts. African Americans specifically pay into the energy system $41 billion every year. However, when it comes to the traditional energy economy, the fossil fuel-based energy economy, only 1.1% of jobs go to African Americans, and 0.01% of revenues from the economic sector that powers the rest of the economy go to African Americans. And so you have a catch-22 where people are disproportionately dying from a system that is not yielding any sort of economic benefit or environmental benefit for those same people. It's a form of economic extraction and an environmental injustice. There are a lot of specific struggles throughout the country, throughout the world. There are transnational forms of violence implicated in the energy supply chain that we utilize, but I'll just leave it there for now. So how we involved community. I work for an alliance, right? And the alliance is made up of grassroots organizations serving New York City's most environmentally overburdened communities. Our board of directors is made up of our members, right? So decision-making power, as Roseann was saying, decision-making power needs to be kept with community, and whatever we do is in solidarity with, in support of whatever self-determined decisions are made by communities. In that process of decision-making, what we came to realize was that our members who disproportionately live near power plants, some of the most polluting power plants in the country, wanted to develop renewable energy systems that were community owned. So that way, the benefits in the form of the actual electrons generated from those solar panels go to the right people, and the economic benefits, the revenues generated from these renewable energy infrastructure projects, stay within the community and are creatively reinvested through democratic decision-making processes. It's a really exciting model that completely flips on the head this very corporatized structure of energy extraction that we utilize to power our homes right now. And it falls in line with what we call a just transition, which is a transition out of an extractive economy towards a regenerative economy that intends to repair historic harms, right? A lot of these neighborhoods are formerly redlined. And, so it was also seen as this holistic anti-gentrification strategy where revenues generated from these projects could help reduce rent burdens and other types of displacement pressures. And so it was really thinking holistically, and it was really, really profound and fascinating. And we supported them in trying to do that. And all this came from the community, right? This kind of visionary stuff came from the community. And so we can't discount how important experiential and practical knowledge is, as opposed to just academic, ivory tower, hierarchical, privileged knowledge, yeah, hope that answers the question somewhat.
No, that was great. And I know both you, Kartik, and Roseann really spoke about the power of local knowledge and lived experiences. But I do want to bring it back for a second, because most people here in the space are health professionals or aspiring health professionals. And we have come here and formed this new ambassador program to empower young and emerging health professionals to be leaders in the climate justice and environmental justice movement. So I'm wondering, Ans, I want to go to you for a second. I know that you work in public health and you're also a doctor. You have you all have a lot of experience in health, but what do you think the power is also of having health professionals be really big voices in this movement? And why do you think it's important for young people, particularly health professionals, to become involved in environmental justice? And how can they leverage their voice to work with communities and empower them?
That's a very simple question. I just want to take a quick moment and uplift what Roseann had mentioned earlier. All of what these folks were talking about is music and honey to my ears. But I just want to sort of begin by saying, when she was talking about credentials, I think we need to be, there's a danger in becoming self-referential, right? Where we begin to think, and there is a certain degree of narcissism that sort of comes in with all these little letters we collect behind our names. So I just want to uplift that part and highlight it, that whenever y'all make it, which y'all have already made it, but in those decision-making capacities, right? So think about that part that privilege cuts both ways, right? The systems of oppression, it's important to remember we can be oppressed and oppressors at the same time, right? In so many different ways, especially when we're in decision-making capacities, right? So being very, very self-critical and thinking about being self-reflexive and not letting this thing get to you, and remembering again, just uplifting what Roseann had already mentioned, that communities are the experts in their own issues, right? So our job really is being the facilitators in that part. So definitely wanted to highlight that part. The second thing to your question that you asked me, well, young people, I think revolution is going to come from TikTok. So that's where I think young people and their role is just absolutely critical. I think this is something we're not acknowledging it as much, but we're not leaving a whole lot of options for young people, but to tell them that they need to just shut up and suck it up, right? So and for them, they're not going to be left with a lot of options there. So that's where the sort of I think they're not going to have a choice but to engage in that political action and advocacy and so on and so forth, right? So I think the only thing I would say is that for the younger generation, really scrutinize just about any category that you think about, going back to what Kartik was mentioning earlier related to capitalism, for instance, right? I'm a migrant to this country and moved here about 10-ish years ago. And one of the things that I will never get over is that just how gullible liberals are in this country. It's and that's sort of and I think that's a reflection of American society, that we no longer live in a market economy. we live in a market society, which is to say that we're used to thinking now in terms of, competition and sort of privatization, everything we think along those lines, right? So let me pose a quick question and then I'll just make a quick comment specific to health professionals. If you know the answer, keep it to yourself, but I'm only interested in the guesses. So as you understand, in the United States, we have a marginal tax rate, right? Which is to say, as your taxes go, as your income goes up a little bit, you're taxed a little bit more, right? So think about it. Don't Google it. I'm only interested in guesses again. So just put it in the chat. And if you're not comfortable sharing it with the rest of us, you can private chat me. But share it with me. What do you think has been the highest marginal tax rate in the United States history? So just give me those answers. You can just private chat me those. What do you think has been the highest marginal tax rate in the United States history? Come on, y'all. I teach. I'm gonna call you out, so I have no problem or shame in doing that. Okay, all right. What else? Other guesses? Come on, y'all. Keep them coming. Okay, I got 10. I got 30. I got 80. What else? More guesses. Okay, I got 28, 25. Okay. All right. 20. Okay, so marginal tax rate in the US history has been upwards of 90. So that's something, so let that sink in. So I bring that up to say that when we talk about what younger people need to do, or health professionals, so health professionals' role come in because there are few other group of people who are more trusted than health professionals, right? Like, public does not trust even their religious leaders, politicians, or just about anyone. They have a lot more trust and faith in health professionals. So your voice carries exponentially more weight than just about any other group in this country, right? So just keep that in mind and think about that is part of your positionality, right? Like the power that you have when you communicate it, right? Now, I shared this text part in here because often when you talk about dismantling capitalism, or what are those broader systems that we need to be put in place after dismantling this stuff, everyone clutches their pearls, like, how are you going to pay for it, right? Because we've been convinced, like this thing has been beaten into our heads that we cannot tax people more, right? And I'm not giving you an example from a Nordic country. I'm giving you an example from the United States of America, right? Like, up till Reagan era, we had a pretty high tax rate. How did you pay for World War I and World War II? This country is a militaristic nation that takes great pride in winning wars, right? So how do you win those? You tax people. That's how you make that equipment. So that's a question of, that's a political and moral question, that what are your priorities, right? So if you do think that climate change is an existential crisis and we need to do that kind of investment that is going to save the planet, not just this nation, then we need to be thinking about it as in a much more aggressive way, and really questioning this notion of, the scarcity mentality that's been beaten into our heads by both Democrats and Republicans, right? And so sort of like, so that's where I think like younger people need to not foreclose those categories and question and challenge those very fundamental foundational assumptions that are beaten into our heads, right? And more importantly, question the freaking Democrats. Like, I think like liberals are so freaking lazy in this country. It's incredible. Like, it's just like, it's like, so that's where, if you were to compare Joe Biden to a statistically average politician in Europe, he will look like a right-wing nutcase president, right? But in the US context, he qualifies for a liberal. It's beyond me, right? So reflect on it and think about that part, that just because our political spectrum is pushed so far to the right, that does not make it so. So keep that context in mind as you operate and think about these broader issues. Now I'll get off my soapbox.
No, we love the soapbox. It's great. You said so much there that I have so many extra questions, but I think when we think about all these intersectionalities and all these issues, it comes back to governance and democracy, and there's all these other intersectionalities. But one subject you did mention, Karthik, was the idea of a just transition. And I want to come back to that a little bit, because I know that is part of the equation, and about transitioning our country and fighting the climate crisis, or mitigating climate change, is this idea of a just transition. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what a just transition is, what your work, especially with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, how that has configured into a just transition, and how you think environmental justice fits into that equation as well.
Also a really short answer. No. So yeah, again, a just transition, and if you want a more robust definition, I'd suggest looking up. You just go into Google now and type in the Climate Justice Alliance and just transition. And if you want a cool visual of what it looks like, type in movement generation just transition. They have a zine that the Climate Justice Alliance actually uses in all their meetings to inform people about what the just transition is. But basically the idea is, we're very quick to critique the conditions as they exist. And oftentimes we spend less time dreaming of what it would look like if we won. And a just transition is basically a transitional process to this society that we're striving for. And what that society looks like is one in which we acknowledge the historic oppressions that were implicated in the structuring of society for centuries. It democratizes leadership. Americans love to talk about how we're like the vanguard of democracy, but electing representatives to speak on your behalf is a very, very limited understanding of democracy. Democratizing decision-making in all realms of our lives, including the economy, where a board of directors and shareholders is not like who makes all the big decisions, but rather worker owners or consumer cooperatives, different models of enterprise that allow for decision-making to be democratized. Those are some of the elements that go into what a just transition looks like. Also, significant amount of attention is paid to labor, right? So we have a lot of communities and workers, families who rely on polluting businesses, enterprises, actors in the economy in order to put food on the table, right? Like, what does a power plant worker do with all of the advocacy going on around shutting down coal-fired power plants, right? So part of a just transition is also looking out for those communities and those families who very often are left hanging out to dry through previous economic transitions. You think about the white working class coal miners in West Virginia, like with the mechanization of coal mining, a lot of those folks have been left out to dry, right? And so a just transition would look out for people who have had, unfortunately, and oftentimes not of their own choice, a very intimate relationship with polluting entities in our economy, and ensure that they get viable jobs, economic opportunities, decision-making power in this regenerative economy that we're trying to construct. What did that look like in New York City? Community-owned renewable energy systems was one way in which we were trying to do that. Yeah, and I can go on, but I'll stop there for now.
If I could jump in, if it's okay with you, Kartik and Ans, I'd love to build off of what you all were saying earlier. I love what Ans said about questioning liberals. So, Massachusetts is like, oh, we're this like wonderful beacon of progressiveness. Bullshit. Sorry, folks, right? I swear a lot, but bullshit, right? So as Massachusetts is moving towards all this, we're going to electrify cars, we're going to electrify the bus fleets, we're going to electrify this and electrify that. Where is that hazardous infrastructure going? Environmental justice communities. Massachusetts is one of 2 states that was named by the Center for Effective Democracy for failing because it's a failing grade essentially for citing toxic pollution next to low-income communities and communities of color. Us in Wisconsin got failing grades in 2016. I'm sure there are many other states that are doing it just as poorly. But in Massachusetts, it's like, oh, we're doing so well. No, you're not. Like the infrastructure is going in environmental justice communities. So a few months ago, our governor and our Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs are standing on their lovely green soapbox saying how wonderful the state of Massachusetts is and how we're moving so much towards clean energy. Yeah, and where is that infrastructure going? In environmental justice communities on sites that were promised to be parks, and instead those parks are no longer on the table. And the utility company that's charging ratepayers all of this money is putting this hazardous, dangerous infrastructure in communities and excluding people from the processes. So I'm talking specifically about this East Boston substation that Eversource, our utility company, is proposing. They're proposing it on the banks of the Chelsea Creek on a site that not only is expected to flood, has already flooded from climate change, is right next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel that's used for Logan International Airport, and in one of the most densely populated environmental justice neighborhoods of East Boston, and also across the street from a heavily utilized public park. Eversource has specifically excluded the Spanish-speaking neighborhood from being involved in this process. Nobody in the neighborhood knew that this infrastructure, this substation was being proposed in their neighborhood until we started door knocking and telling people, do you know what they're proposing there? This is a crazy project. $63 million that will be pushed out to the ratepayers. So Eversource reaps all of the benefits. They further harm an environmental justice neighborhood. And then we learn on top of this, right? Like this is Eversource that in a few weeks, they'll be touting themselves as this big green company and they'll put out their PR stints for Earth Day. Meanwhile, they're proposing this substation in East Boston, and also proposing 10 dirty diesel generators in Chelsea, and preventing solar power from being connected to the grid because they don't want renewable energy from coming online. They don't want to support a community-owned microgrid. We keep saying, stop proposing archaic infrastructure. Go with the community-led solutions like Kartik was saying. We're proposing a community-led microgrid here in Chelsea. Let's move forward towards renewable, resilient, reliable energy instead of relying more and more and more on these dirty sources of pollution. And this substation, while it's providing electricity, where is it connecting to? A dirty power plant in Everett. It's all coming from this one source. So you can't, dissect it and say, oh, no, this is clean and this is a good company. No, none of this is good. And so I think, to Ans' point, we really need to be critical of liberals and people who are in positions of power who are just, have the blinders on. Nope, we're just going to get here without looking at the big picture. And it's really harmful to environmental justice communities.
Wow, thank you for sharing. And I'm actually from Boston. I've known about the electrical substations being proposed and how they've excluded a lot of members in Chelsea from hearings. And I really commend you for all your work on that. I want to step back a little bit and bring it more to the topic of health just for a moment, because we all, again, as I said, we all are health professionals here, or we work in the intersection of health. And a question I do have for all of you is, as we are really challenging and being self-reflexive, and we're thinking about health in general, we do know that a lot of the roots of illness are oppressive in nature. So I'm wondering if we can think about, for all of our health practitioners, how can we learn to treat the oppressive roots of illness and integrate justice into our practices, or if we have future practices, or if we're doing public health work? How can we integrate that element of justice, not just environmental justice, and just step back a little bit from that? And I'd like to hear from all of you about this. Anybody? Ans, want to kick us off? You're on unmute.
Oh no, my bad. Yeah, I think it's very context dependent on sort of like, project to project to project. So, like for instance, we were talking about just the renewable energy. So yeah, and I don't talk about this like pie in the sky macro level challenges for the sake of it. I've shifted thinking towards those issues because I think if we don't scrutinize those broader categories, it limits our imaginations, right? Like, then we're sort of like, our sandbox is very limited and we're told that these are the boundaries within which you can play and that's the extent of it. So even sort of like, along the same lines of just transition and who are the communities who are impacted, I'll just share that one quick example of it that, like even solar panels, right? Like everyone is enamored by solar panels and renewable energy, right? But you got to remember that this is a country where our Supreme Court just blocked a child slavery case against Nestle and Cargill not too long ago, related to cocoa plant, right? Like, they were producing those and, like the companies they were hiring were engaging in child enslavement, right? Like to do that work. And our Supreme Court doesn't think that it's our problem. So that's the power of capitalism. So I give that example to say that when we talk about solar panels and renewable energy, all those human rights issues around the globe are my issues, right? Like, so I cannot talk about it in this nifty little clean way where it suits me and politically expedient and just like, then leave all that part aside. So thinking about that part, so taking a life cycle assessment approach from ideation all the way into the grave of it. So like, who are the people who are mining these elements to people who are going to be recycling these elements and who are those communities around the globe who are going to be impacting? So I think like that's one way of sort of like, thinking about from the initiation to the very end of it. There's just really exposure differentials, right? Like, that really becomes the key, like, who has the power, who doesn't have the power, who are the people who are putting on the margins of the society or were already on the margins of the society. And now we're basically outsourcing that part, kind of, uplifting again what Roseann had mentioned earlier, because you got to remember this country has a tendency to privatize the benefits and the profits and socialize the risk. Right. So that's something you got to remember. Like any issue that you're thinking about, be it your organizational stance, be it your federal policy, state policy, just reflect on it and think about that part, like, and those answers will come to you, like, so because we love throwing the terms like critical thinking around all day long. But what does that mean in practice, right? Like, so in practice, it really means that we're going to have to go through some degree of discomfort, that it means that we're going to have to change our way of doing business or how we thought the world works, and then approaching it and thinking about how do we integrate those particular protections across our policy sphere, right? So again, like, I know that's a very macro level answer to that question, but I think that's really the key, that no matter what specific policy or problem that you may be looking at, the idea isn't that, we trash them and deconstruct them all day long. I get paid to do that part and I love it. But it's much more harder to come up with good, equitable solutions to that part, right? Like, so that's the key of it, right? So when we think about, so taking this basically climate in all policies approach, that no matter the sector or program or policy you're looking at, think about climate equity implications, the existing one it's going to exacerbate, as well as the new ones it's going to create, right? And then thinking about like what protections we can build into sort of like, any of that part. Just because I mentioned solar panels, so an example of that would be thinking about like how our government is negotiating international trade agreements, right? Like, whether or not we're building in those worker protections related to climate change into those trade agreements, right? So that's sort of like, that's just one example of like, the entire thing becomes your space to be intellectually curious, and then thinking about like, what are those good imaginative solutions that are going to slowly help us on that journey of equity, because there is no destination, we'll never get there. That the notion of destination is a very white supremacist notion, so it's sort of like, and it's important to avoid it, but remembering to, as Donna Haraway says, that stay with the trouble.
That's great. And Kartik and Roseann, I'd love to hear from you too, just about all of what Ans said, but also just about the oppressive roots of illness and coming back to integrating justice in our health practices.
I guess I can jump in since my name was dropped first and I can stop talking sooner. So in terms of the oppressive roots of illness, I just want to read an excerpt from a book real quick, just to like provide some context. So the quote is, "Practitioners of modern medicine are not trained to be healers. They are trained to be biomedical technicians. When the causes of poor health lie outside of the patient, in the environment or in society, doctors are frequently at a loss." And that came from a book where each chapter basically goes into a particular physiological system within the body and goes through different kinds of pathologies within that system and expands it out into how structures in society, specifically colonialism and capitalism, are implicated in those physiological problems, right? And I actually have a book here. It's called Inflamed, and it's by a physician and a political economist, and you should get it. And this would be your real med school curriculum. I think, like going off of the quote, it's really important to know what you don't know and who does, right? So like it's super important to know that, as Ans said, if you're a physician or maybe in an allied health profession, you are one of the most trusted people in society when it comes to whatever comes out of your mouth, for better or worse. It's not like doctors know everything, right? And so what do you do with, how do you leverage that privilege in a way that opens up opportunities for other forms of knowledge to be appreciated, other people to, again, have decision-making power over their lives, right? How can physicians think creatively around that stuff? One example would be maybe at the institutional level. So through the Affordable Care Act, billions of dollars were given to hospitals in order to pursue community health projects. That money could easily be given to communities through decision-making over how that money can be used could easily be given to communities. And there's an article called Renewable Energy as Preventative Medicine through the Next System project. It's a really cool article. Basically, they propose that hospitals can be anchor institutions for community-owned renewable generation, similar to the kinds of projects that we were working on in New York. You just need to identify where opportunities exist for relations of power to shift as you are trying to advocate for these environmental solutions to the climate crisis. Because as Ans mentioned, with the solar panels and the supply chain issues, like the violence implicated in producing solar panels, that's what happens when you try and solve the climate crisis only by making emissions reductions your god, as opposed to understanding how climate change is also an opportunity for us to fundamentally change relations of power between people. And how do you do that in the clinic? How do you do that in the hospital or in healthcare institutions? That's something you all need to figure out, so that you don't get super tired just banging your head against a brick wall known as the Democratic Party. You can find creative ways to empower people who you should be listening to on the ground. Hope that made sense.
No, that was great. Yeah, so we are running into the clock a little bit, but Roseann, I want to hear what you have to say. And then maybe we'll just have some time for some final thoughts and maybe one audience question.
So I don't have, that's a hard act to follow, right? I don't think I have very much. The only thing that I would offer is what we've experienced here locally is that, our residents are going to seek care, and as Ans and Kartik said, MDs are so trusted, right? They're such a source of trust in community, and yet they're getting maybe 20 minutes max, right? 20 minutes of FaceTime with their physician. And so that's structural you know, that's structural inequities that need to change, right? And so I would encourage you all, as you're out there in the field and the practice, to give each one of your patients the time that they need, right? And so I think what we saw throughout COVID, and you can look up some recent cases that have made the news. We've seen some local health institutions sort of just say, oh, you have a respiratory, you have a sinus infection, or you have something else, and just like let folks go from being seen, and then they end up in the hospital with debilitating cases of COVID, or babies dismissed, or the baby's fine, go, and then the baby passes away, right? And so it's that system of, we have to see the next patient. Okay, we're gonna move this one on, we're gonna move this one on, sort of like a what do you call it, what I'm talking about, the next one. Anyways, so I would say spend more time with folks. It's not just push them through the line and get to the next person. Really, really, really spend time with folks and invest in their health, because they may not advocate for themselves. They may, and folks shouldn't be discounted. A conveyor belt, that was the word that I was looking for, like a conveyor belt. People are just going through the conveyor belt.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, all of you. This has been such an informative conversation. I want to open it up. I know that some of you have to hop up at 2. I just want to leave the time for one audience question, and then I encourage you all to bring other questions. We will have our first ambassador meeting the week of the 4th. So if you do want to bring some more questions to that and continue the conversation, because we want to continue this conversation, it's very important. But I just wanted to open up to anybody that you can raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat if anybody has last question to ask our 3 panelists. You guys outdid yourself, I guess. Any other questions? Any final thoughts you guys want to impart on all of our amazing ambassadors before we wrap up? Oh, Jeff.
Hi, just Jeff Carter. I'm the executive director of PSR, and I was just in the chat. This was a really great conversation. I'm all revved up now, so I really want to thank the panelists, and Roseann in particular. I'm from Boston also, and the long tragic history, and not all tragic, but the long. Chelsea has a fascinating history, and I would encourage everyone to. They're interested in this to dig in there. I'm old, so I remember the fires back in the 70s, and I remember receivership and all kinds of things. So anyway, just really fascinating stuff. So thank you all. Thanks for letting me sit in.
Thank you. And we do actually have one question from the chat. I did not see that. Thank you so much. Anna has a question. It says, any advice for bringing this to school administration? I don't know if any of you want to take this. I know, Ans, you are an academic. I know all of you have, and also Kartik, all of you have ties to academia.
I think just remembering that you have a lot of power than you realize. I think the power of existing systems, again, capitalism, neoliberalism, is that it will have us believe that we are all individuals. And again, America's favorite porn is individualism, right? So and the way it reflects is that systems have us believe that we're not this collective group of people with collective agency, right? And students have a lot of power from critical race theory onwards. The kind of movement students have led, it's incredible. So just, pull together and be the squeaky wheel, tell them over and over and over and over again that be creative and integrate this stuff into your curriculum, right? It's just we need to learn to be able to demand more from powers that be. We don't do that enough. And, now you have wonderful resources. Kartik, I haven't started reading the whole thing yet. I've just been skimming through it. So I just want to uplift that. Do check that book out. It's fantastic. And I also want to, share this particular, going back to colonialism and how it connects to our biology. Dr. Maria has this like really wonderful graphic that I've used for many times in my classes and so on and so forth, that kind of creates this sort of like, a conceptual pathway from colonialism to trauma and inflammation. I shared it in the chat with you all to check it out, to help sort of like, make sense of how these systems, capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, are connected back to human physiology and impacts us in so many different ways. But that book is fantastic. So yeah, just think bigger and bold, like it's like, that's something, I know that sounds really metaphysical, but really just, you got to be able to think in longer time scales, right? Like, we talked about Texas a moment ago. So think about those longer time scales. If you were to go back a few hundred years and ask that, oh, let's dismantle British Empire, people would laugh at you. They would be like, what a ridiculous idea. How could you even say that, right? Like, a similar thing are applicable to eugenics, enslavement of human beings in the United States. But you got to think about that, like, people fought for it and we are better for that part, right? Like, so don't forget that part, that think in longer time scales and not let this sort of like, pettiness of our existence bog us down from what we can do.
Great. I just really appreciate everything that you have mentioned, all of the projects and the hard work you have put in for years. And I am really excited that you all are here, ambassadors, and really excited to embark on our new program. I want to hand it over to Mari for some just final housekeeping and any announcements or anything.
Firstly, I want to thank all the panelists. You were all wonderful and I learned so much, and I'm sure that our ambassadors did the same. Moving forward, as Becca said, there will be our first in-house meeting the week of April 4th, and you will get more information on that likely next week. If you have any questions pertaining to this event, the upcoming event, or climate ambassadors in general, you can reach out to myself or Becca. Otherwise, we'll say thank you all so much, and we can't wait to see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Mari. I know that this is a lot of labor of love that sort of like is unappreciated or underappreciated in so many different ways, and just the painful logistics that go into making this stuff happen. So thank you